All right, so welcome to the lecture on succession. This is chapter 20. It is the last chapter we are going to look at for these ecology lectures. Let's talk about succession. So if you look at the United States, you can see that we have these distinctive biomes that occur over much of the country. Here in the eastern U.S., we have temperate deciduous forest, temperate grassland, boreal forest, tundra, desert. If you were to continue down, you'd have tropical rainforest. We have these definitive biomes that occur. Certain vegetation tends to dominate any particular region. We can see clearly that biological communities and life, what we have changes over time, but why do we see these certain biomes dominating regions of the planet? Well, the idea is that the biomes represent what are called climax communities, which means if you have a certain forest and you come in and disturb it somehow, it's going to take a while, but after many years of successive habitats, it will eventually reach the climax community once again. That's the idea of this succession model. Whenever you have a disturbance, over time, it leads back to this climax community. And those climax communities are what we see as the biomes across much of the country. So what is succession? Succession is the change in plant, animal, and microbial communities in an area following disturbance or the creation of new substrate. So disturbance is going to be anything that displaces a large number of living organisms in a particular region and opens up area that was not previously available to be colonized. We'll talk more about that here in just a second. Primary succession involves disturbance that opens up a substrate that has never been available before, or at least it hasn't been available for an extremely, extremely long time. A couple of examples would be retreating glaciers. This picture shows a glacier in 1977, and much of the glacier melted in 2006. This gentleman here is standing on an area of exposed rock that has not been exposed for thousands upon thousands of years. This is primary succession now. The species that colonize this substrate are colonizing a substrate that has not been available and used by other living things for a very, very long period of time. Another example of primary succession would be a lava flow. The island of Hawaii still has volcanoes that are actively spewing out lava, and this lava, when it hardens, forms ground that can then be colonized by plants. New ground that has not been colonized before. Basically, primary succession involves a totally newly exposed ground area. Volcanic islands like the formation of Hawaii, that would be another example of primary succession. Secondary succession is what we see here in Missouri. Secondary succession involves succession, which again would be change over time of a community following a disturbance. Secondary succession involves succession following a disturbance that does not destroy the existing substrate. So what happens here in Missouri would be things like logging, fire, floods. Those are good examples. Many more are tornadoes, right? Things that ultimately change, eliminate the vegetation, change the very structure of that living community, but they don't actually produce new substrate like we saw with the retreating glaciers or the lava flows. So secondary succession, you are usually disturbing the vegetation to the point where you are going to start the process of succession over again, but you're not actually having new substrate involved. In most models of succession, what we see is that certain plant species are better competitors with a newly exposed substrate, or in the case of secondary succession, substrate that is not newly exposed but now has a bunch of availability for new species to colonize. So in most models of succession, we see that certain plant species have the ability to colonize newly available substrate immediately after the disturbance. The name of these species are pioneer species. Pioneer plants are fast-growing, very tolerant of sun, because if something's been disturbed, usually the tree cover is gone. And they tend to be poor competitors, but I want to leave that here, after a while. Basically, these guys are the best suited for immediate colonization. They find newly disturbed areas and they thrive until other species take hold, and then once other species are there, they can't compete with the conditions that occur after the other species are present. And so then they tend to die out, and eventually the other species form a climax community. Climax communities do not include pioneer species. So over a while, pioneer species are gradually replaced. Ultimately, over time, we end up with a climax community. In our part of the state here, this includes oak hickory forest, the deciduous forest type, that seems to be the climax community that we now have. So, yeah. I want to quickly look at the three types of explanations for succession, explaining why it happens. The first type is the facilitation model. This says that many species try to colonize a newly opened substrate. Only a few species are able to establish that themselves, and those are the pioneer species. The pioneer species, as they grow, change the environment of the area that they're growing in. They basically facilitate or open up that area that they live in to become better suited to other species. They kind of cause their own destruction, so to speak. Pioneer species modify the environment in such a way that it becomes less suitable for themselves and more suitable for other species. They're facilitating the environment for other species. I believe this one has a lot of support based on the data. The tolerance model teaches that all species are able to colonize newly available substrate. Species that colonize the substrate early on have no effect on the colonization of later species, so this says something different from the facilitation model. And thus, this teaches that species that are ultimately able to form the climax community are simply the most tolerant of the environmental conditions long term. Basically, this one teaches that pioneer species arrive early, but ultimately die out because they're just not well suited for it. Climax species arrive a little bit later, take a little bit longer to establish themselves, but they're just better suited ultimately for the environment, and so they thrive. There is some evidence for this one, but I still hold that the facilitation model is the one that best explains what we see. The inhibition model, I don't even like it. I don't think it has any supporting evidence, so we're going to skip it. Let's take a look at an example of succession in a Missouri field. These two species are extremely quick colonizers. The one in the top left is called horseweed. This one is a species of crabgrass. You also would have species like dandelions, potentially clovers, very quick growing, fast colonizing species that are the first ones to take over a newly exposed substrate. This can be an abandoned crop field, a recently leveled forest, an area after a fire destroyed all existing vegetation. These are among the first species here to colonize that newly exposed area. After a little while, you see flowering plants come in that tend to be a little bit slower at getting there than these other species were. Some of the plants here that we see are some asters and goldenrod. These are both native species that bloom primarily in the fall, right? But these would occur probably if something disturbed an area in the spring. These would probably be growing by that first fall. They're very quick growing, but not quite as quick as horseweed and crabgrass and those other species. Another species here would be ragweed. After a while, certain grasses tend to dominate. This is another species of goldenrod, by the way. And now that I look at it, I think this is actually ragweed. This one is actually ragweed. This is definitively goldenrod. This is a native species. This is blue stem grass. And so blue stem grass would tend to emerge and dominate an open area as the predominant herbaceous vegetation for a little while, until we ultimately get what I call the king of pioneer species, which is the red cedar. These will show up very shortly after a disturbance, but at being a woody tree species, it takes a little bit longer to get established. But once they are, these tend to dominate old abandoned fields and disturbed areas. They are the first tree species that generally becomes abundant in these fields. And so here we have, you can see a whole bunch of them dominating this landscape. After a while though, oak trees and other deciduous trees will start to sprout. They will eventually grow taller than the cedars, and the cedars will die. One way to tell that an area was disturbed decades ago is to find tall, dying, or dead cedar trees under the canopy of a bunch of oak trees. That tells you that that area was disturbed in the relatively recent past, decades, 50, 60 years ago or so, and that they have since been overtaken in stature by oak trees, and they no longer have the sunlight they need to survive. This is, I think, the most prevalent pioneer species you're going to see. But over time, what we have is we have this trend of succession going from fast-growing herbaceous species up through some woody species. You might have another tree called sumac that tends to grow here along with the red cedar, and eventually going all the way to the climax community of deciduous trees and deciduous forest. I believe the next picture shows that, yeah. So we destroy the original climax community. Farmland that was used ends up getting abandoned. We have some annual plants like horseweed, crabgrass, asters, goldenrod, etc. that starts to take over, but dominates after a couple of years. We have primarily blue stem, goldenrod, etc. Cedar trees, it calls it pines, but cedar trees start to take over. Sumacs, which are a tree technically, but they're more shrub-like, begin to grow, which in my opinion, it facilitates the growth of oak trees and hickory trees, which then ultimately overgrow the cedar trees who die from that new condition of having a canopy around or above them. And after a period of almost a century, we end up with a mature oak hickory forest, just like we had prior to the disturbance. That's an example of succession in a Missouri field. Different communities tend to have different levels of stability, which is the absence of change. Many of the forests in the eastern U.S., they think, were quite stable prior to European colonization based on the size of the trees that were there. The old growth forests used to have giant trees that had to be several hundred years old, which indicated hundreds of years between disturbances. Also, ecosystems, certain ones are more resistant to disturbance. The tundra, for instance, with its very short growing season, it's very, very sensitive to disturbance. I went up to Pikes Peak when I was younger, and there were wagon ruts up there from 150 years earlier. that still, you could see them quite clearly, even though they'd only been used, only a few times had that route been used, you could still see the ruts because it was a very sensitive community to disturbance. Resilience is the ability of a community to bounce back after disturbance. One of the big concerns with tropical rainforests is that they're not particularly resilient. Once they are cut down, the soil that they have there does not facilitate the regrowth of the tropical forests very well. In fact, they think that once it's cut down, a lot of it becomes savanna permanently because the complete absence of any type of cover does not facilitate the regrowth of tropical forests. So resilience, ability to bounce back after disturbance, very low in tropical forests. Quite good here in the eastern United States, right? We have a lot of regrowth of our forests here. Even though they're not to the level of old growth, they're still pretty good. Resistance is the ability of a community to maintain structure in the face of potential disturbance. So certain communities are much more sensitive to disturbance than others. And last but not least, certain communities never get to climax community stature. Certain communities are maintained through fire or continued disturbance. Temperate grasslands and savannas generally don't have tree growth, but people who have plotted houses out on the prairie, they're able to grow trees around their house. So the trees can grow there, they just don't naturally. Historically, frequent fires likely kept trees from growing in prairies. Glades are a special community here in Missouri that occur in the forest where you have complete absence of trees due to the soil and the sunlight that is hitting that particular side of the slope of the hill. And so these glades are often maintained by fire. And so the Missouri Conservation Department burns them to ensure that we have native glade communities instead of letting those red cedars take over. So disclimax is the name for this. It means that the community never actually gets to climax community status because of continued disturbances that prevent that from happening. That is our lecture on succession.